6, verses 6 through 8. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has showed you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. The word of God for the people of God.
That was an absolutely new hymn to me, but it is a really good hymn. I really like that one. When you go and apply for a job, we want to know what are the requirements. You know, some jobs have requirements. Do you have to have a high school diploma? Do you have to have a college degree? How many years experience do you need? And a combination of other things that the employer may set. If you want this job, you have to meet these requirements and or qualifications. The more technical the job, the higher the requirements. Well, it's not just jobs that we want to know what the requirements are. Micah talks about requirements here. Micah wrote a few years before the northern kingdom fell to Assyria in the 8th century BC. And in chapter 6, God and the nation of Israel are actually in a lawsuit with each other. One of the neat things about the prophets is that they couch their writings in the form of a lawsuit sometimes. Sometimes God's suing the people, sometimes the people are suing God, and they deal with these issues in that form. In chapter 6, hear the mountains, the lawsuit of the Lord. This is God speaking. The Lord has a lawsuit against his people. With Israel, he will argue. My people, what did I ever do to you? How have I wearied you? Answer me. I brought you up out of the land of Egypt. I redeemed you from the house of slavery. I sent Moses, Aaron, and Miriam before you. So God set out his side of the lawsuit. What have I ever done to you? How have I wearied you people? I sent you Moses. I sent you Joshua. I sent you Miriam. I sent you prophets. I sent you kings. What else? Well, the people respond to that in verses 6 and 8 that Cricket read for us. What do you require from us? Well, we think we know that answer already. I think they're being a little bit sarcastic there because they knew what God was requiring of them. And so they were just kind of sarcastically, well, what do you want from us? And God gives them an answer. So they ask him, what do you want from us? Do you want year-old calves as an offering? Do you want thousands of rams? Here again, I think they're being sarcastic still. Do you want rivers of oil? Do you want my firstborn child? What do you want from us? But before we get into that answer, let's look at this from our perspective today. What would we delineate if we asked God, what do you want from us? What would we say? I think if we were to poll most people, they would say, well, keep the commandments. And to which we would say, which ones? Well, you can start with the Big 10 and work your way down from there. So that's what a lot of us would say. Some of us might say, well, have faith in Jesus. That should have been the first one. But that doesn't always come out that way. Have faith. Go to church on Sundays. You know, there are some people who believe that if they're not in church every Sunday, absolutely, their soul is in mortal jeopardy. Well, I think it's important to be in church. I've always said if you're in town and you're not sick, this is where you need to be. But I know life gets in the way sometimes. But, you know, a lot of people would say, well, go to church. Well, we should. Don't do what you know you shouldn't, is what some people would say. And the converse of that is do what you know you're supposed to do. And we think that covers everything. If we don't do what we're not supposed to, and we do what we are supposed to, everything's covered. All the bases are there. Don't add any laws to the faith. You know, there's 630 commandments in the Bible. But if you talk to most Christians, we've added about another 630 to the Bible. You know, in the tradition Debbie and I grew up in, there was a whole long list of things you weren't supposed to do. And as long as you didn't do those things, you were considered okay. Whether you kept the big ones or not, as long as you kept these, you're okay. One of them was women couldn't wear pants. And a woman coming to church wearing slacks was, everybody jumped back because lightning was about to strike. And you think I'm kidding. I'm not. So we've added a lot of extra rules. You know, growing up as a kid, when somebody asked you, what does your church believe? They didn't want to hear, we believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. We don't smoke and we don't drink. We used to say we don't cuss and we don't chew and we don't go with girls who do. That's kind of the way we answered that question. So don't add any laws. And then lastly, some people would say, well, we're to love God and to love our neighbor. And Jesus said that sums up the entire law of Moses. Do that, he told one guy, and you will live. But you see, the answers that we give changes the question. Like people in Israel's time, Micah's time, we think in terms of what we have to do to please God through religious ritual and ceremony. Now, I kind of like the ritual and ceremony. It means something to me. But that doesn't mean that as long as I do those things, that I've done everything I need to do. Ritual and ceremony has a place, but it's not the end of the faith. It's just really the doorway into the faith. Micah states that God is more interested in how we live than in our religious practices. Now, Micah's answer was both easy and hard. It's easy because there's nothing you and I can do to really put ourselves in right relationship with God on our own. That's the easy part. We don't have to do anything to make God love us because God already does. But it's hard because God expects us to dedicate the entirety of our lives to Him and not just outward expressions of some kind of pious ritual. So in some ways, we're not unlike the people in Micah's time. We have this long list of do's and don'ts, and as long as we do those, we're okay. As long as we don't do those things, we're okay. Now let's look at the answer they were given. What do you want from us? Do you want 1,000 rivers of oil? Do you want my firstborn? Do you want 10,000 rams? Do you want hundreds of bulls? What do you want from us? And he told them 3 things. He said, first, do justice. Now, in our time, when we think of justice, we think of Law and Order and Jack McCoy. You know, the TV show Law and Order. If you have to say, Ron, what's your favorite TV show? It's Law and Order. Okay, I love that show. But that's what we think of when we think of justice. We think of a jury, and we think of a defendant, and we think of a prosecuting attorney, and a court-appointed defense attorney, and they argue it out in front of the jury, and hopefully each side gets the verdict they want. Both sides can't at the same time, but they're arguing their case. We think that's what justice is. And in our world, it is. Now, they had law courts and stuff in Israel's time, in Micah's time. They had trials. I don't know if they had juries, but they had people who decided the guilt or the innocence of the person. So they had that kind of justice as well. But a lot of times, especially in the Old Testament, when you hear the word justice, it means something a little differently than just right or wrong, guilty or innocent. To do justice in the Old Testament meant to be fair and just in your treatment of everybody. To do justice was to treat everybody as an equal. You don't favor the rich man just because he's rich. You don't favor the poor man just because he's poor. You treat everybody equally and fairly. And that was hard to do in those days, and that's hard to do in our time. It's hard to do that because we all have our own foibles and prejudices and things that we believe and don't believe. And so we look at people and we make instant decisions that sometimes are way off base. But he said that if you're going to do the right thing, the first thing you have to do is to do justice. And sometimes we don't like that idea. We don't like the concept of justice in that way. We want to keep people where we think they belong. In Luke 18, one of my favorite stories is the tax collector and the sinner in the temple. The tax collector goes up and stands right in front of God and says, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like that man. I pay tithes on my vegetables. I fast. I do all of this stuff. One New Testament commentator in his commentary on Luke said, the man looked at God, but he contemplated himself. I'm not like that guy. And that guy at the back stood way at the back, away from the altar area, and he beat his chest and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus asked the question, which one of these two went home justified? You see, that Pharisee was not practicing justice. He wasn't treating that man fairly or equitably. And we do that in our world. I think of James chapter 1, verse 27. James wrote, true devotion, the kind that is pure and faultless before God, is this, to care for the orphans and the widows in their difficulties, and to keep the world from contaminating us. People don't like that verse because it doesn't talk about faith and belief. It talks about doing justice. Faith and belief are important, and James tells us that they're both important, but you can't have one without the other. The first thing he said is to do justice. It doesn't matter the person's skin, doesn't matter their economic status, it doesn't matter. We are to treat people the way God would treat people. We are to treat them with justice and mercy and compassion. The second thing he said is to embrace faithful love. Now, this word gets translated various ways by the various translations that we have. Some use the word mercy, some use loving kindness, some use faithful, love, all comes from the same word. Doesn't matter, but in the Hebrew, it has a meaning more about loyalty and faithfulness and love. When they translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek about 200 years before Jesus, called the Septuagint, when the translators got to a certain Hebrew word, hased, they almost always used the Greek word charis, which is the New Testament word for grace. You are to embrace faithful love. You are to embrace grace. See, that's a very important concept for us. There was a sign I saw one time that says, "Grace is not a blue-eyed blonde." Grace is the unmerited favor of God. It's the faithful love of God. And Micah says that we are to do justice and we are to embrace faithful love. You see, there's these qualifications, these requirements that Micah's talking about are far different than the ones most of us would think of. It may be easy not to drink and dance, but it's a different thing to look at these requirements that Micah's talking about, to embrace justice, to embrace and to do faithful love. Those are harder things to do. But again, nobody ever said that faith was easy. And if they have, they haven't been in the faith very long. The last thing he says is to walk humbly with God. We, in our culture, we have this idea that humble means wishy-washy, mealy-mouthed. When I think of humbleness and meekness, I always think of Wally Cox. Remember Wally Cox? Always played this little meek and mild guy, never would do anything. That's what most of us think humility is, but that's not what humility is. Humility is knowing who you are and what you believe, but you also realize that you don't know everything. You don't have all the answers when it comes to God. In all these debates that we've been having in our church, one post stood out really challenging. I don't know which side of the debate this guy was on, but his post simply said, "Have you ever thought that you could be wrong?" We don't know everything. People who say, "Well, I know what God would do." Do you really? Has He told you? Our television evangelists want you to know they know everything about God. But I got news for them. They know less than most of the people in the pews. That's my opinion. Sometimes we Christians act as if we know all there is to know about God. We have a word for that. It's called arrogance. To walk humbly with God is to realize that we may not know everything we need to know. We may not understand everything we need to understand. We follow and we do, but we do it humbly, realizing that there is an extreme possibility that we could be wrong. So, what does God want from us? Well, He wants us to do justice, to treat people fairly, equitably. He wants us to embrace faithful love, to embrace grace, to embrace mercy, to embrace kindness. And He wants us to walk humbly, realizing that we don't know everything. I read someplace, and this has kind of been my motto, the more I know, the more I realize how much I have to learn. I don't know everything. What does God want from us? I don't think we can get a better answer than Micah 6. To do justice, to love mercy and kindness, and to walk humbly with God. Jesus summed it up. Love the Lord your God with the entirety of your being, and your neighbor as yourself, and you will have fulfilled the law. Amen.